Some of my background, I am a faculty member. I've also worked in university assessment. So I straddle those two sort of fields. Um, it's a bit unusual in that I'm not, I work external to my university primarily for a variety of reasons. I work with NILOA. I have been since 2014. I work with the American Historical Association in their tuning, which is a sort of an assessment in curricular coherence, curricular mapping, determination of student learning outcomes. Initiative, I work with the John Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education. John Gardner is pretty famous for, being one of the first people to really think seriously about first year experiences as sort of a coherent way to introduce students to the college, to college life. I am a TILT trainer, if you know what that is, transparency and learning and teaching. Quality matters. I do a lot of different things. So I wear a lot of different hats. But what I want to really talk about today is student learning outcomes and why, from a faculty perspective, these are essential to doing good assessment. Okay, so let me ask, first of all, for those of you who are in assessment offices, what's the role of faculty in assessment at your institution? Anybody?
What's the role of faculty? You mean doing the assessments? Or did you mean that, is this a trick question? Hi, Felicia Calkin, Grossmont.
A little bit of a trick question. I mean, is it, okay, so do faculty just do the assessments for you? I mean, yeah, what is the role of faculty? Not much, okay. To ensure learning, okay. Designing, implementing, okay. So what is, as we've got, complete the assessments, okay. So this is sort of, these are standard answers, reporting, right? Yeah, we're often sort of the reporters. Update your assessment processes. Okay, good. More than you might think at first blush. Okay, Felicia. Okay. Okay, it looks like for a number of you then, what I'll be talking about today is kind of a little bit, will be some review. Let me ask you this though, what's the role of students in your assessment processes? Anybody? Anybody got something to say about the role of students? Okay, their learning is being what, yeah, complete the work. Okay. Ideally, they should help co-create your student learning outcomes, right? They may not, the subject of the research, assessment takers, feedback on assessment work revolves around them. So you've got, some of you seem to have some kinds of structures in place where students are intimately involved in assessment. And so what the big takeaway points I'm going to want to talk about today, and I got to pull up my screen here, are the involving faculty and students more completely in assessment, and why. I'm gonna move this over here. Here we go. Sorry, should have had that up. There we go. Okay, so why and how we can do this work. How can we involve faculty members more fully in assessment work? How can we involve students more fully in assessment work? And what does assessment really mean? Okay. So anybody who wants to, just please, jump in. I don't do very well at monitoring the chat. So Yarek, if you could monitor the chat for questions, that would be great. Okay.
Absolutely.
So when we look at assessment, right? Assessment has, as we all know, assessment has all these multiple purposes, right? Multiple responsibilities of institutions to the accreditors. There's accountability. We talk about effectiveness. A lot of times we talk about our students graduating on time. Are they meeting our expectations for learning? But what I really want to focus on today is learning improvement, right? So using assessment to intentionally and systematically measure student learning. So it's a process. It's a process of, I don't like the phrase continual improvement, because improvement, sometimes you take 2 steps back before you go 3 steps forward in an assessment. So I like to think of this as a very intentional way to look at student learning, to understand that sometimes things need to change, that sometimes the changes we make are not sufficient. They need to be reevaluated. And as such, I like to think of assessment as a very dynamic process. So it's something that faculty do all the time. A lot of faculty members don't know this, though. They don't recognize the ways in which they do assessment all the time. Okay, so I really want to talk about using assessment to identify learning gaps. And I'm not looking really at data repositories here, although I do that in my own work. But I want to look at how it is that faculty members and students together can create more robust assessment structures. And assessment structures that are really student focused, okay? So when we talk about, for most of you, this probably looks pretty familiar. We talk about these metrics of student success. We have all these various report cards. We report stuff at the university level to the voluntary system of accountability. We report to our system offices. We report to our statewide offices. But we really look at these metrics like retention and persistence, at course completion and DF and withdrawal, DFW, poor bad grade rates, right? Somebody asked me the other day in talk, what's DFW? And I just blurted out Dallas-Fort Worth. Maybe that's my feeling about Texas, but hey. DF and withdrawal grades, transfer rates, time to degree, and graduation rates. Those are the standard metrics of student success. And those all really depend on grades. And so essentially what we're doing is we're using grades as proxies for student success. And I find that really problematic. I mean, it is a rough measure, but I find it problematic because grades, when we talk about grades, and the way that faculty members assign grades, there is simply a lot of what I call radio interference. There's a lot of confounding factors in assigning grades to students that make them unreliable as proxies for student success, right? So one of the big questions, of course, is when you assign a grade to a student, what happens if a student submits a late assignment? Well, many instructors they penalize students for late assignments. That is an equitable procedure or practice rather. It means that when you dock grade, DACA student, penalize a student for submitting a late assignment, that essentially your grade no longer is linked to your student learning outcomes, right? And these kinds of evaluations reflect all kinds of other factors in student performance, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. But I want to talk about this just for a moment. In a personal case, we had at Cal State Long Beach, I was chair of history at the time, we had a methods course, a first semester junior year, first upper division course for students that had about a 30% fail rate at one point. Enormous fail rate. Okay. There was lots of angst about this. When I actually, and so I looked at our prescriptive advising database materials, and it suggested that, you know, students who getting a DF or W in this course might lead to, especially in the first semester of transfer, because this was a transfer major, might lead to students not graduating. Well, the problem with some of our prescriptive, and we used a package that a lot of people are enamored with, but it's based on past data, not present data. You cannot project student success using these past course performances. So what I actually did is I drilled down into the actual granular level, the student records of almost 2,000 seats, about 1,950 seats that were filled by students. Remember, these are mostly transfer students. 30% of them are failing, getting DF or W in the first semester of their transfer experience. That sets them up for failure. When I actually drilled down into the data, if you got a D, F, or a W, right? I mean, this sounds really horrible, 30%. If you got a DF or a W, that grade actually predicted that you would finish the bachelor's degree in history successfully. And in fact, what we found was D's, F's, and W's had very little to do with student performance or student learning, and a whole lot of others to do with things like particular instructors. There were certain instructors that simply needed to be removed from that course because they engaged in practices that were inequitable. I'll just leave that at that. As a former chair, I can't really talk much more about that. But for those of you who have been department chairs or division chairs, you know what I'm talking about. So we had problems with certain instructors. We also had problems with transfer shock. So we had not normalized transfer shock, and that was a real issue for many of our students, that they didn't understand that even though they had been very successful as community college students, that learning at the university, especially in a high expectation major like the history department was, it required a different sort of set of skills. So one of the things we noticed is that many of those students who got D's, F's, and W's had extraordinarily high community college grades, for instance. I got the chat, okay. However, at a particular point, and we looked at historical data, at a particular point, these students who were going through community college during the Great Recession years were attending 4 or 5, sometimes 3, 4, or 5 different community colleges to get the courses they needed. And so they were transferring into Cal State Long Beach, having managed you can sort of think about it as juggling, had sort of managed their courses very successfully by sort of compartmentalizing their work at different community colleges. They might take, a math class at Cerritos and English Comp at Long Beach City, and two history classes at Golden West. So they were coming from different institutions into one institution, and they simply did not get enough training in how to think about focusing deeply on your courses rather than sort of just managing, sort of juggling a set of courses. So there was a lot of transfer shock there. The other thing we noted is that, and of course, the suspicion was among the faculty was that we had classes that were simply too hard. That wasn't the case at all, because the narrative that the students who left our program because they got a D, F, or W and went to an easy major, and unfortunately, our faculty members often thought of communication studies as an easy major. It's not at our university, but there was this sort of sense that all these students that are failing, washing out of the history methods course, were going on to major in communication studies. We found of all those students who had failed, gotten a DF or a W in that course over the period of 10 years, we found that only 2 actually transferred into communications studies. What we actually found is that students during the Great Recession were using, they didn't care about history methods. They were also using the history major as a backdoor to get into more popular majors like engineering. And so we had a number of students who transferred immediately upon, after, during their first semester at Long Beach, immediately into things like biochemical engineering. They simply couldn't get into it as community college transfers, but once they got a foot inside the door, they were using their status as Long Beach State students to gain access to difficult majors. So we had a bunch of those students. And then among the students who did not return to take the course again in the subsequent semester, the vast majority, about 80% of those, and that was a relatively small group, so about 25% of those students did not return or did not persist at the university. About 80% of that 25%, so what is that? About 20% of those students, 18 to 20%, were actually, they failed every course that they took at the university. They simply weren't ready for the university experience, or there were other things going on in their lives. In many cases, they were mental health challenges or financial challenges. And so when you look at this metric of student success and say that this is a high failure course and we're not meeting our goals for student success, that wasn't the case at all. Because you can't, when you actually looked at their patterns of taking courses, those DFW grades as proxies for student success really didn't hold up at all. So that's a little sort of a long story, but it indicates that perhaps we need to sort of reframe how we think about assessment and using grades as proxies for these measures of student success. I know that we're never going to, I'm no Pollyanna. I know that we'll never get away from using grades, but let's think about how we grade, how we teach, how we grade, and how we really truly assess student learning. So I want to suggest here a way to reframe assessment as not a set of metrics of student success that are based on grades, but as emphasizing the true, authentic assessment of student learning, in which improvement and equity are really the drivers of assessment, and in which faculty members and students collaborate along with assessment officials to support learning for all students. So we need to be mindful of these differences sensitive to diverse experiences. We need to engage in pedagogies of care. There's all kinds of things. So let's look at this sort of breakdown when we think about assessment from a faculty member's perspective, right? Grades, so we went through this, but what is assessment, right? Good assessment is clearly aligned with these student learning outcomes, right? It measures achievement of specific outcomes. And evaluation tools are used, so it's not idiosyncratic, and raters are usually normed. That's not always the case. It really depends upon the discipline, the program, and sometimes even the course. And it also uses, it evaluates performance using these single artifacts or assignment. So it's not a grade in which you look at multiple assignments, but you're looking at a single thing. How are students actually doing? Where can we uncover sort of the places where they might be stumbling in a course or a program? Okay, so let's talk about why SLOs matter. I think, do we have a question here? Okay, any specific best practices to avoid or minimize radio interference in grading? I'll get to that in a moment, but generally, you really sort of, to go back to this slide, generally we want to think about assessment as focused on a specific learning outcome. It's aligned. Alignment here is key. So the evaluation has to be aligned with the learning outcome. The assignment needs to be aligned with the learning outcome, and it measures that the achievement of that specific outcome. So when you do that, you can really minimize this radio interference. You can sort of take out of the equation, you can take out things like late assignments or missing assignments. Now, that's not entirely true, but we're looking at groups of students, not individual learners, when we talk about assessment of student learning outcomes. So, just reading the chat, okay. So when we think about a faculty view, right, student learning outcomes matter, and they are really, we think about them having three essential uses, right? They are communication devices. They are the way that we tell our students what you will get out of this assignment, out of this module, out of this course, out of this program. And they are nothing more than, excuse me, statements of what you will know, understand, and be able to do at the end of X, Y, Z. They are useful to students because they communicate to students what a particular course or program will provide to them. They are also essential to well-designed courses and programs. So this is alignment, alignment, alignment. This is the key to well-designed courses and well-designed programs, and I would say also to effective guided pathways. That they take into account they create essentially a learning system or a structure for learning that is clear to students. So you start with the institutional learning outcomes, the program learning outcomes, the course learning outcomes, and then sort of at the bottom, the module learning outcomes. So you almost have sort of a pyramid of alignment here. So, and alignment also provides curricular coherence, and it can provide some real efficiency to institutions as well, because you take out those outcomes that don't matter, right? You take out, if you've got a course, for instance, that doesn't quite fit in a program, maybe it needs to be revised, or maybe it needs to go away. And I can say I was a consultant to one college, one community college in another state that had a GE curriculum of over 500 courses, most of which weren't taught regularly, but they were still on the books. And students were, they would often see the description of a course in a course catalog and say, I want to take that course, and it wasn't offered. And so that was really delaying students' time to degree or completion rates, because they were hanging around waiting for a course that just wasn't any longer part of a curriculum or wasn't taught regularly. So if you have a system in which student learning outcomes are prioritized, you can create this sort of inherent coherence to your programs.
We do have a question.
Okay, I would.
Yeah.
Okay.
From Elizabeth. Sure. Since SLOs are not all equal, how do we pitch this or structure grade assessments in a way that doesn't generate more work for faculty? An example, a course with 3 exams and 10 SLOs that are spread unevenly in the 3 exams.
Okay, so I'll get to that in a minute, Elizabeth, but I think what you're really asking me is, how do we do assessment to, how do we help faculty work smarter, not harder? How can we help them design effective assessments to meet those SLOs? And it doesn't really even have to be, yes. You know, it doesn't, the meeting of those, the demonstration of those student learning outcomes does not even have to take place within an exam environment. It can take place in a variety of other environments. So I will talk about that in a few minutes. But I think that that's what you're trying to get at, is how do we get faculty buy-in to this? And I'll get to that in a moment. And I think there's a key here, which we need to really think about. So, and then also talk about SLOs as these building blocks of good assessments of student learning. You can't do good assessment of student learning. You can't really know what students know and are able to do unless you have good student learning outcomes and align your assessments to facilitate students demonstrating their achievement, those SLOs. So here, I'm really sort of a hardcore proponent of assessment and not accountability. I know that accountability has a role in modern institution of higher education, but as faculty members, as a faculty member, assessment here is key. I want to know what students know. And I can also bring in another example from my own field. With the restructuring of our methods course, one of the skills that was downplayed was a skill that is essential to history majors. It's defined as one of the essential skills by the American Historical Association. So it is one of the competencies, and that competency is to be able to source a document. Well, I found out in the last few years teaching the senior seminar is most of our students did not know how to effectively source a document. It's a very simple process, but it requires faculty members to actually teach that skill. And it involves not actually looking at the document, but actually looking at who created the document, for what purpose, and what was the audience, and what was the historical context before you actually go into analyzing, reading the document. Okay, so that's the process of sourcing a document. I use I was using an assessment, very brief formative assessment, to determine whether students could source a document. Now, these are graduating history majors. The document was a 1932 painting. This is from Stanford History Education Group. It's an off-the-shelf formative assessment. They also have off-the-shelf civic reasoning assessments for those of you who might be interested. But it's a historical sourcing a document assessment created for middle school and high schoolers. And it asks students, it gives the provenance, it gives the author or the artist, the year of creation, the painting was of allegedly the first Thanksgiving, 1621. It asks students to talk about why the painting was or was not an accurate representation of the first Thanksgiving. Almost, I'll put it this way, only those students who had their methods courses with me one semester, which was less than half the class, only those students knew how to source the document. You don't look at the painting. You don't look at where the Wampanoag are situated, which is sitting at the feet of the pilgrims. You don't look at any of that. You look at who created it, when it was created. It was created in 1932. It has no relationship whatsoever to an accurate representation. It is not a useful document for determining what actually happened at the first Thanksgiving. We were graduating students in our program without that fundamental skill to source a document. So these are students who are getting A's, but they didn't know how to source that document. So here, again, you have an accountability measure in grades with an assessment that there was a mismatch. There was simply no alignment here. Okay. So when we talk about student learning outcomes, we talk about it to faculty, when we talk about it to students, we need to really think about these as communication devices, statements of what they will know and understand and be able to do. They decode learning, right? They unmask, they make the college experience a little bit more transparent. They communicate. We communicate to our students. This is what you really need to focus on, right? We get away from, is it going to be on the test? Those kinds of questions. It clarifies, right? It tells students exactly, this is what you are going to know. This is what you're going to be able to do. And hopefully you can also map that out and explain to them how that matters to their future careers or their future interests, future courses they may be taking, how it matters to their degree. And then it reinforces, right? It reinforces and organizes this sort of system of learning. Did we have another question, Stacy?
Yes, I think we're getting some robust commentary going on. Emily shares one of the evaluation strategies is developing learning in cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. And York has chimed in with students need to know what they are learning.
Exactly. Students need to know what they're learning. And sometimes faculty are not even clear about when they write student learning outcomes. It's getting better over the last 10 years. This is my sort of, when I talk about student learning outcomes and communicating essential skills and knowledge, this is my sort of favorite little cartoon here, right? We need to Marie Kondo our student learning outcomes. We need to look at our student learning outcomes. Are they needed? Even if they aren't needed, does it spark joy? Is there something in that outcome that leads to the further development of skills, or that helps students be more curious about the world, that leads to lifelong learning, right? But student learning outcomes, the late Cliff Adelman, who worked with the tuning initiative in the American Historical Association, had this idea that they should be 5 words. 5 words. Strip them down to 5 words. If you can't do that, they're probably confounded with other kinds of outcomes or ways of thinking, disciplinary ways of thinking, radio interference, right? Can you create 5-word SLOs in your program? Doesn't mean that you need to have 5-word SLOs, but can you create them? Prioritize what's essential and Marie Kondo them, right? For those of you who are familiar, not familiar with Marie Kondo, she's sort of this internet star who's all about house cleaning. And when we think about the process of assessment, I think it's really important to think about design thinking. And this comes from, of course, Wiggins-McTighe's Understanding by Design. It's backwards design processes. This is one way to sell faculty on the idea of rewriting or revisiting their SLOs and thinking about assessment and thinking about how to sort of strip away all that stuff that's not important. And what I train a lot of faculty, and what faculty sort of realize when they start thinking about their student learning outcomes and aligning their assessments to their student learning outcomes, all of a sudden they realize they do a lot of stuff in classes that really don't lead anywhere to improving student learning or to helping students achieve and demonstrate those student learning outcomes. Okay, so we start here with the SLO, right? This is the building block of good assessment. And then you think about what does that look like? What does it look like to use proper grammar? Can we define that? Can we then, once we have a clear idea of what acceptable evidence is of meeting those SLOs, can we design our learning activities? Can we measure them and then reassess and improve? So assignments in this sense are assessments. And this is what I really recommend if you've got a lot of faculty who are very suspicious about assessment, is develop a culture on your campus at your institution in which assessments of student learning utilize embedded assessments. So they utilize actual assignments that faculty design using this process. Okay.
We do
more
have
questions?
One question from the chat. So
Sure.
what does it look like to use proper grammar?
What does it look like to use proper grammar? How about using, so you've got, you avoid verb tense problems, right? Between subject and verb. So you use they are and not they is. Let's say, come on, there's got to be some English folks here.
Yeah, I think this was necessary. I think this is the statement that you actually used, and I wanted to emphasize that. So it sounded like a question, but it really is a rhetorical one, because it's up to the faculty to determine that.
Yeah,
so
it
it's
is up
not
to the faculty
necessarily that I'm asking you specifically for specific example, right? It's more like, okay, what does it look to, what does a good poem look like, right? Or what does, articulation of a formula in physics or in chemistry, what does that look like? So I think you've made the point. You look at the product, you looked at the evidence.
You look at the product, you look at the evidence, and you define that, and you determine that before you even design the learning activity. And this is really key. Like faculty, when they go to design a course, they usually, they get the course, they get the student learning outcomes, and then they sort of they may adopt a text that's required, or they may find their own. They design learning activities. A lot of faculty members have sort of favorite ones. They may not have any relationship whatsoever to your learning outcome. So that in those cases, you're not really advancing the achievement of your student learning outcomes. Okay, so let's look at then a learner-centered view of the assessment cycle. Here, it's just slightly different than a faculty view of the assessment cycle, where you name your expectations for learning, so students become familiar with their learning outcomes, with what they're expected to know. You communicate those to learners so they're able to explain that. You collect their work. They produce work that meets those SLOs. They understand what does and does not meet those SLOs through very clear statements of criteria for meeting those SLOs, whether you use rubrics or annotated assignment examples. There's all kinds of ways to do that. And then you determine, as a faculty member, you determine the extent of learning, and then you strategize new student success plans, sometimes preferably in cooperation, in collaboration with students. So in this model, which is a bit more equitable, assessment also begins with communicating these SLOs. So the student view. So in one study, students were asked what kinds of skills they wanted to practice in a general education course. They were given, they were asked to choose one, their top priority of skills. There were 807 responses to this question. And it didn't actually matter what GE course it was, but what they wanted, it was pretty sort of spread pretty evenly. They wanted critical thinking skills. They wanted to be able to learn how to analyze problems better. They wanted, this is a key one, I was surprised by this one, they wanted to become more culturally competent. So they wanted learning activities that help them be more responsible to people unlike themselves. They wanted ethical reasoning. They wanted more writing. They wanted collaborative activities. They did want some oral communication, information literature, learning how to find and assess literature, especially online, was less important. I would say it's more important now in our highly politicized society. But when you actually ask students what they want, they will tell you what they want out of their GE. It's not just a course, it's not just a grade to them. They will tell you what they want. And students are very clear as well. Lots of research point to the fact that students view teaching and learning as these relational activities, right? That they're just not consumers of education, but it should be a two-way street as far as their learning goes. Okay. Did we have more questions?
We do. We have one. So what if we incorporate everything we have learned about SLOs into our regular exams?
I think I need a direct question. So I need some context here.
Shirok, do you want to add anything?
See, rather than doing a separate type of learning assessment, whatever that we learn, just put it in our regular exams.
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. That's called embedded assessment. Okay, when you actually create a learning activity or an assignment that assesses your learning outcome, that is a valid form. It is probably the most valid form of assessment of student learning. It is an embedded assessment. Okay, does that clarify?
That's what we do actually, especially in subjects like economics. It would be very difficult to have a different types of assessment unless it is incorporated into regular exams. And by regular exams and questions, we would understand if a student has actually learned.
But you need to make sure that those exams are aligned with your outcomes.
Right. That right. I understand.
And that's the part there that there is sometimes a misalignment. The faculty think their assignments are aligned, or they're just not very attentive to their learning outcomes. So when we look at sort of this, let me check this. Okay. So we look at these sort of prioritizing these learning systems, right? I'm on the academic side. A lot of faculty members think they know their students better than student affairs side folks do. Student affairs side folks often say they know their students better. One of my sort of gripes about higher education is that we're really heavily siloed, right? That faculty have sort of their area in which they operate, student affairs have theirs. There's not a lot of sort of clear collaboration between the two sides of the academic, or two sides of the institutional house. So I think when we think about as faculty members creating our robust inclusive assessment systems, one of the things that's key for an institution is to bundle assessment training for faculty within faculty development. Faculty get you might have flex days where faculty get training in a particular pedagogy, but they may not get that deep training and assessment they need to understand how they can best use for instance, an active learning pedagogy. You also really need, so that's key. The very best assessment programs in the country that I know of tend to have co-located assessment and teaching and learning faculty development offices. So if they're not in the same office, they are co-located. And I'm thinking, for instance, in our system in the CSU, Cal State Monterey Bay is sort of the example of doing great assessment and great faculty development. So you can really improve your assessment by offering more training and assessment within those faculty development spaces. You want to measure your achievement of your SLOs, plus, right, incorporate your traditional your metrics of student success, your time to degree. What's really key here is with the SLO, so you can provide these clear pathways to success. You can create these intentional learning structures, right? All throughout this, we want student support. Faculty members need student support, student affairs personnel. We need the accessibility counselors for from our disabled or differently abled students. We need advising help with students, but on the other side of the house, advisors need to be able to talk to faculty members and understand what's actually happening in the classroom. Okay, so I can give you a very brief example of this. Professional development, research assessment, student success, equity, that all goes together. That's right, Stacy. Those are the best cases. Elon University is another case where Center for Teaching and Learning and Center for Assessment are bundled together. Okay, so some principles of equity as faculty members, when we think about teaching and learning and in assessment practices, right? These are sort of the principles. I want to point to this though. Anybody want to guess what 87% refers to? If we're talking about equity. Okay, 87% refers to the percentage of students in one large assessment survey, the percentage of students who skipped an assignment, who did not prepare for class, who didn't do an assignment. So you've got 80%, you've got the vast majority of students are not doing some assignments in their courses for a variety of reasons. A lot of them having to do with equity issues. They simply don't have the time, or they're late and they become discouraged, or they did not do well on a particular assignment, so they begin to question whether they belong at the institution. So 87% in one large study showed that students simply just weren't doing at least one assignment per course per term. So that has some real implications for equitable practices. When we use learning outcomes as this guide and a means to focus our offerings and our assessments, we intrinsically indicate what is essential. So we want to determine here what's essential. We want to ensure as faculty members that our materials the things we ask students to do, our assessments, our assignments are aligned with our SLOs at the course and at the module levels. We want to ensure that we're offering multiple formative assessments within our courses. And by this, I mean low stakes, often ungraded or very low stakes grade weighting opportunities to practice skills. And importantly, to apply content. And here we're going to get down again to the issue of authentic. Are we asking students to apply their skills in ways that are not only important to demonstrating the learning outcome, but also boosting their sense of why they are doing this, what it means for their futures? How will applying those skills or manipulating that content help students in their intended careers? How, you need to have faculty ask themselves, have they incorporated active and collaborative pedagogies in their courses? Do they offer opportunities for students to collaborate, even if it's unofficial? So at our university right now, what's really taken off for students are sort of organic student initiated Discord channels to talk about courses. Faculty are up in arms about this because they see it as a way for students to cheat. I think we need to reframe that discussion. Maybe it's a way for students to talk about what's important, and if they feel that they need to have a private Discord channel and they can't ask you, there's an issue there with alignment and with clarity and transparency in education, in teaching and learning. Do we offer multiple supports for learning? Do we offer opportunities for improvement? If a student does poorly on one assignment, can they recover? Do we offer exam wrappers, for instance? Do we change our, do we offer opportunities to redo an assignment? Are our assignments clear and transparent, right? Do they tell students why? This is directly from the Transparency in Teaching and Learning and Teaching, the TILT group. But do we indicate to students the purpose of their assignment? Do we tell them how to do it? And then do we provide criteria to show them what a good assignment looks like, what a good demonstration of learning actually looks like to students? Are our assignments authentic? Do they lead to something else? So for simplifying algebraic equations, for instance, why do students need to learn how to simplify an algebraic equation? Well, because that's a form of writing in mathematics, and to learn how to simplify an equation can lead to developing better mathematical skills. Their simplifying equations are often used in, for instance, demographics and disease modeling. So for instance, if a student wants to go into biology or wants to go into a laboratory work environment, they need to learn how to do some of those things. And we need to explain that to students. And do you create spaces for student voices to be heard? Do you listen to them? Do you offer them opportunities to discuss the course at at various points in the career? Do you offer pre-course surveys? Do you ask students to explain, do you ask students rather how you can help them improve their own learning? So there's all kinds of things that instructors can do. And this is why, to boost student assessment of learning, to make it more organic, one of the things that's important though is we need that faculty development to focus on assessment and to link those pedagogies and those practices back to assessment.
All right, it
So,
looks like we do have another question in the chat.
okay.
So for Martin, for a math class, how do we distinguish between the many individual learning objectives and the bigger concept SLOs? So for example, quadratic formula to solve for x-intercepts versus use algebraic and graphical techniques to solve for x-intercepts. The latter is a bigger idea that is assessed over many learning objectives. Math department struggles with consolidating our many learning objectives into a few SLOs. And in the example I provide, a student can show that they can learn the SLO for one type of function, but not for another type of function.
Okay, so that's a good question. And that's all about creating learning structures and opportunities for practicing these skills. And I'm going to show you some visualizations of what that actually looks like in a couple of minutes. Okay. And I hope that comes, let me know if it doesn't really address your question. But essentially what you're talking about is these more granular outcomes are really modular or even assignment or lesson outcomes. And they should link back up to your more global learning outcomes for the course. So if we think about the role of SLOs in improving education and sort of breaking down some of these inequities in higher ed, we can also think about how they can contribute to pathways. And this is actually an example from a construction management course in project management. So one of the course learning outcomes was to formulate successful project management practices on a construction site. The module learning outcome was to develop a site safety plan and identify and assign safety officer roles within a workforce. So what do you have students do? If it's aligned, you want them to understand site safety plans. They need to read OSHA regulations for construction industry. They need to learn how to identify job site safety methods, perhaps job site safety problems. They need to identify that. They also need here in this module learning outcome to identify roles and responsibilities for all site personnel, right? So that they can then assign those safety officers. If you build this out a little bit more, you can use an exam to identify your job site safety methods, right? And that essentially is just one assessment that will help students develop a site safety plan. So they need to know that core content, the methods of job site safety before they can develop a site safety plan. So again, you sort of got this, it's almost like a Russian doll here. But if we look at curriculum maps, this is what we often see. And this is really not very intuitive. It's not intuitive for faculty members. It's certainly not intuitive for students. So when we see sort of your program learning outcomes, these are more like ILOs, but whatever. You've got course A, course B, course C, course D. You've got the I's that, you know, the introducing, the developing, the mastery levels. Where do they do this? You know, here you've got a gap where in critical thinking, course A gives them an introduction, but by course C, they're expected to master it. Well, where else do they get to practice it? Do they practice it in course B? Here you've got developing without an introduction. You know, we know as assessment professionals, we know how to use these. Faculty have a hard time with this, however. So it's often more important to think about how we visualize our curriculum mapping and our curricular coherence. And so I like to use this, and you could just sketch these out. You don't need to use, you know, Word or Excel sort of process templates here. But you've got essentially these three elements at the basis that form the basis of a beginning student's experience, where they practice their communication skills, they practice their critical thinking. And let's say this is a course in licensed vocational nursing. They may practice some basic skills, practical skills development. They may learn how to, for instance, take blood pressure. Okay, and then you go in here to beginning program courses, but then I got to go back here. So then you got to go back and forth across this curriculum. So as students begin their practical skills development in, say, a CTE course like LVN, they take a blood pressure. What if they have to think about it? What do they do if a patient has very high blood pressure? How do they communicate that? How do they write that blood pressure reading on a patient chart? How do they communicate a potential issue to a higher level of care professional? And then you move into, again, these techniques of inquiry in your beginning program courses, and then your advanced program courses sort of are the umbrella that subsumes all of this, all of these activities and these skills, these competencies. This is a different sort of visualization of learning. This is actually from a piece of software that is institutions don't use. I use it only as a way to visualize what learning looks like, because it utilizes this gear process. So this is a sample IT program set of courses. We've got database concepts 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then your activities, your senior level activities. But if we break these down, so we've got database concepts 3, you can use you can use a process template. You can use something like this. You can simply write it down in an outline form, in which you take one course, you break it into your weeks, and then you indicate here what are your learning outcomes, describing characteristics of SQL, write statements in SQL, how do you modify SQL tables, SQL queries. And so you've got very clearly a set of relationships between learning plotted out week by week within a module. And I'll get to an question in a moment. I'll go back. So we have a couple questions.
Yes, so we had a question. What software is this?
This is CourseTune. What's interesting about CourseTune is it's an institutional product. So institutions purchase it. However, individual programs can purchase a new product, and it's really minimal. I think it's like $15 a month or something like that, $10 a month. Programs can, or individual faculty, you can chart out your entire curriculum up to 8 courses using the course plan option of CourseTune. It's very affordable and allows, especially for community colleges, if you have relatively few sort of courses, you could do this. If you've got an 8-unit GE pattern, of course we don't in California, you could use course plan to do that. So it's a really affordable way to visualize student learning outcomes, learner activities, and assessments. And all of these, CourseTune and course plan, are both integratable into learning management systems. So that you can pop them right into Blackboard, to Canvas, to Desire to Learn, Brightspace, Moodle, whatever you use, they are all integratable into your learning management system. And what makes this interesting is that then faculty within a program can see what other faculty members are doing. You can actually build this out and include a next level over here. That is your assignments. And then if you want to, if you don't like this visualization, you can automatically convert back to the traditional curriculum map format. Okay. Questions?
But
you can see the
provided some links. That's all.
Okay, great. So what you can see here is that visualizing these learning systems makes learning much more accessible, makes the system of learning much more accessible and understandable to both faculty and students. And I think that's what's really important. You can actually take one of these course, essentially curriculum maps, module maps, and you can drop it into your course. So students can click on this and see, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to describe SQL in week 8. I'm going to write statements, and then they can pop over here and they can look at the actual assignments. So, and there are other ways to do this as well. You can build this into your learning management system using course modules, for instance. Same essential way of prioritizing SLOs and learning activities and assessments and aligning them all. Okay, so how do we optimize our responses as faculty members, right? As faculty members, we need to sort of acknowledge that teaching is relational, right? These relationships can be transformative, and I think most college instructors recognize this. Sometimes, when we're down in the trenches and we've got, 180 discussion posts to grade over the weekend, we sort of forget that, but we always need to keep that forward in our minds. For assessment officials, when you talk about assessment of student learning, we always need to keep in mind that faculty are the experts. Okay, faculty expertise and autonomy really needs to be part of this conversation, but faculty members also need to be trained so that they understand essentially how to do their jobs better and be more effective instructors by prioritizing learning systems. All of us need to recognize, as I think we're increasingly doing, that equity is a moral responsibilities. We should not ever use the language of gatekeeper courses, for instance, right? This is really important. Equity is important. Understanding the ways that our practices impede student success is important. I will give you a very brief example from a course I taught, my methods course last fall. I had a student, the most polite, most first semester transfer student from East LA College. Very polite, very well groomed. Like not a hair out of place ever. Very soft spoken. Turned in all of his assignments in the first half of the semester. They were late. They were a week late. They were 3-4 days late. I don't penalize late assignments, but I do require students to develop a plan or to explain to me what's going on so that I can help them be more successful. He wasn't doing that. So I said, we need to have a meeting. We had a meeting. I said, you got to let me know what's going on. He said, well, I've been reluctant to tell you. And I said, okay, but what's going on? I want to help you. And he said, well, I've been working a lot. I'm an essential worker. And I said, okay, so is like 3/4 of the class. And he said, no, you don't understand. I said, can you help me understand? And he said, I'm a funeral director. He's 21 years old, working as a funeral director in his family's mortuary in a COVID hotspot. Desperate to get out of that business and go become a high school history teacher, I did everything I could to help him succeed that semester. And he actually ended up with a B. He was a successful student. Okay. We need to prioritize our student-centered learning, right? We need to have, multiple ways that students can demonstrate their learning, And then we need also to recognize the power of assessment, right? This is a nonstop longitudinal commitment to student success. Stop talking about assessment as a form of continual improvement, because that really discourages faculty members from participating, because it sends a message that you're doing something wrong, right? You need to continually improve. No, reframe the discussion as a nonstop longitudinal commitment to student success, and recognize that our students change. The demographics of our students change. Okay. So that's my presentation.